Jinshi and Gyokao did not know what such a poison might be, but if the mysterious message was to be believed, that is how the young prince had met his end. It was by simple face powder, makeup used by many people in the rear palace. Gyokao said, "Ignorance is a sin." I should have taken more care with what was going into my child's mouth. I am guilty of the same crime, Jinshi said. He was the one who had allowed the emperor's son to be lost. Others may have died in the womb as well. I told Consort Lihua about the face powder, but anything I say only makes her dig in her heels, said Gyokao. Lihua still had dark bags under her eyes. She used a lot of white makeup to hide the pale color of her face. She did not believe the makeup was poisonous. Jinshi looked at the simple cotton cloth. He thought it looked strangely familiar to him. The characters seemed hesitant, but their hesitation appeared to be a trick. The hand holding the object was unmistakably feminine. "Who gave this to you and when?" "It appeared the day I asked the doctor to examine my daughter. I'm afraid I only succeeded in causing trouble for you, but it was by the window afterward." It was tied to a rhododendron branch. Jinshi remembered the commotion that day. Had someone in the crowd noticed something? Had someone realized something and left a word of warning? But who? No doctor in the palace would resort to such circuitous methods, he said. "I agree." And ours never did seem to know how to treat the prince. All that commotion occurred. On reflection, Jinshi did remember a serving girl who had seemed distanced from the other rubbernecks. She had been talking to herself. What was it she had been saying? "I need something to write on." Jinshi felt the pieces fall into place. He started to chuckle. "Consort Gyokao, if I were to find the author of this message, what would you do with her?" "I would thank her profusely. I owe her my daughter's life," the consort said, her eyes sparkling. "Ah, so she was keen to discover her benefactor. Very well. Perhaps you would allow me to keep these for a short while. I eagerly await whatever you may discover." Gyokao looked happily at Jinshi. He returned her smile, then collected the jar of face powder and the cloth with the message on it. He searched his memory for any cloth that felt quite like this. Far be it from me to disappoint His Majesty's favourite lady. Jinshi's smile had all the innocence of a child on a treasure hunt. Chapter 4, The Nymph's Smile. Maomao first learned of the prince's passing when black mourning sashes were distributed at the evening meal. The women wore the mourning garments for 7 days to show their sorrow. However, the announcement that caused the most frowns was the news that their meat servings, already small, would be eliminated completely for the duration. The women servants ate 2 meals each day, mostly millet and soup, with an occasional vegetable. The meals were enough for small Maomao, but many of the women found them less than filling. There were many kinds of women in this lowest class of servants. Some came from farming families, others were city girls. A few, although it was uncommon, were the daughters of officials. Children born into bureaucratic families could generally expect a little more respect. However, even with that advantage, the work a woman was given depended on her own achievements. A girl who could not read or write could not expect to become a consort with her own private chambers. Being a consort was a job. You even received a salary. I guess it didn't matter in the end. Maomao was aware of what had killed the young prince. It was Consort Lihua and her serving women's generous use of white powder to cover her face. That powder was so expensive, the average citizen could not expect to use it even one day in their life. Some of the more established ladies in the brothel had suffered from it, though. Some of them made more money in a single night than a farmer would earn in his entire lifetime. They could afford their own makeup. Others received it as an expensive present. The women would cover themselves in it from their faces down to their necks. It would eat away at their bodies. Some of them died from it. Maomao's father had warned them to stop using it, but they ignored him. Maomao, attending at her father's side, had witnessed several courtesans waste away and die with her own eyes. They had weighed their lives against their beauty, and in the end they had lost both. That was why Maomao had broken off a couple of convenient branches. She scrawled a brief message to each of the consorts and left it for them. She had not expected them to heed a warning from a servant girl. The girl could not get her hands on paper or even a brush. After the mourning period ended and the black sashes disappeared, she began to hear rumors about Consort Gyokao. People said that after the prince died, the emperor, feeling heartbroken, began to find comfort with Gyukayu and his surviving daughter. However, he did not visit consort Lihua, who had also lost her child. How convenient for him. Maomao finished her bowl of soup. Today it contained only a small piece of fish. She then cleaned her utensils and went to work. "A summons, sir." A eunuch stopped Maomao while she was carrying a laundry basket. He told her to report to the office of the matron of the serving women. The office of serving women was one of the 3 major divisions of service in the rear palace. It was responsible for the lowest ranking of the women servants. The other 2 divisions were the office of the interior, which dealt with the consorts, and the domestic service department to which the eunuchs were attached. What could she want with me? Maomao wondered. The eunuch was talking to other serving girls nearby as well. Something was happening, and it involved more than just Maomao. They must need more help with some task, she thought. She placed the basket outside the correct room, then followed the eunuch. The matron of the serving women's building was located just beside the main gate. This gate was one of the 4 gates that separated the rear palace from the outside world. When the emperor visited his ladies, he entered through this doorway. Maomao did not feel comfortable there, despite being summoned officially. Although it was somewhat lackluster compared to the headquarters of the office of the interior next door, it was still noticeably more ornate than the residences of the mid-level consorts. The railing was worked with elaborate carvings. Brightly coloured dragons climbed the vermilion pillars. Maomao was urged inside, and she was somewhat less impressed than she had expected. The only furnishing in the room was a single large desk. 10 or so other serving girls besides her were present. They seemed animated by anxiety, anticipation, and a strange sort of excitement. "All right, thank you." "The rest of you may go home," the eunuch said. Maomao felt unnatural being singled out this way. She went alone into the next room as the remaining women left with suspicious glances in her direction. Even for the chamber of an appointed official, it was a large space. Maomao looked around, intrigued. She noticed that all the serving women in the room were looking in one particular direction. A woman sat unobtrusively in the corner, attended by a eunuch. Not far away was another woman who seemed somewhat older. Maomao remembered the middle-aged woman as the matron of the serving women. However, she did not recognize the haughty-looking lady. Now she realized that the person's shoulders were rather broad for a woman. Their dress was quite plain. Their hair was mostly held back by a scarf, with the rest cascading down behind them. "He is a man." He was surveying the female servants with a smile, soft and gentle as that of a heavenly nymph. Even the matron was blushing like a girl. Suddenly Maomao understood the flush in everyone's cheeks. This had to be the immensely beautiful eunuch of whom she had heard so much. He had hair as fine as silk. It had an almost liquid presence. His eyes were almond-shaped, and his eyebrows evoked willow branches. A heavenly nymph on a picture scroll could not have competed with him for loveliness. What a waste, Maomao thought, not remotely blushing herself. The men in the rear palace were all eunuchs, deprived of their ability to reproduce. They lacked the equipment they needed to bear children. It remained a matter for the imagination to consider just how gorgeous the offspring of this man would have been. As Maomao was thinking, with no small amount of impertinence, that such almost inhuman beauty might ensnare even His Majesty's attentions, the eunuch stood up with a flowing motion. He went over to a desk and took up a brush. He began to write with elegant movements of his hand and arm. Then, with a smile as sweet as ambrosia, he displayed his work to the women. Maomao froze. The writing said, "You there with the freckles. You stay here." That was the main idea. The beautiful man seemed to notice Maomao's reaction. He turned his warmest smile toward her. He rolled up the paper once more and clapped his hands 2 times. "We are finished here for today. You may all go back to your rooms." The women, looking disappointed, glanced back over their shoulders as they exited the room. They would never know what had been written on the nymph's paper. Maomao watched them leave. After a moment, she realized they were all petite women with prominent freckles. But they hadn't heeded the sign, which must mean they couldn't read. The message hadn't been for Maomao alone. She started to leave the room with the others, but a hand was placed firmly on her shoulder. With much fear and trembling she turned around. She found herself confronted with the almost blinding smile of the nymph man. Now, you mustn't do that, he said. I want you to stay behind. That smile, so bold and bright, wouldn't accept no for an answer. Chapter 5 Attendant, most interesting. I was given to understand that you couldn't read, the beautiful eunuch said slowly and deliberately. Maomao followed uncomfortably behind him as he walked along. No, sir. I am of lowly birth. There must be some mistake. Who on earth would teach me, she thought, but she would hardly have said the words even under torture. Maomao was set on acting as ignorant as she could. Perhaps her speech was not quite perfect, but what could she do? Someone from such humble beginnings could not be expected to do much better. The serving girls of lower rank were treated differently depending on their ability to read. Those who were literate and those who were not both had their value, but if one could read and yet pretend to be ignorant, that was the best way to navigate the delicate balance. The handsome eunuch introduced himself as Jinshi. His gorgeous smile suggested he wouldn't hurt a flea, but Maomao felt something shifty behind it. How else could he needle her so remorselessly? Jinshi had told Maomao to be silent and follow him. This brought them to this moment. Maomao knew that as a servant of little importance, shaking her head at Jinshi might be the last thing she ever did. So she had obediently done as he said. She was busy calculating what might happen next and how she would deal with it. She could guess what had inspired Jinshi to summon her. What remained mysterious was how he had figured it out. She had delivered the message to the consort. A piece of cloth dangled with affected nonchalance in Jinshi's hand. The cloth was festooned with unkempt characters. Maomao had told no one she could write. She had also kept silent about her background as an apothecary and her knowledge of poisons. He could never have tracked her by her handwriting. She thought she had been careful to ensure no one was around when she delivered the message, but perhaps she had missed something or been seen by someone. The witness must have reported a petite servant girl with freckles. No doubt Jinshi had begun by canvassing all the girls who could write, collecting samples of their calligraphy. It was possible to seem less skilled with the brush than one truly was, but certain signs and characteristics would still be noticeable. If that search proved unsuccessful, he would have questioned the girls who could not write. A suspicious fart occurred. Maomao had too much time on her hands. As she was having these uncharitable thoughts, they arrived at their destination. It was, as she might have expected, Consort Jayokai's pavilion. Jinshi knocked on the door. A placid voice responded, "Come in," so they did. Inside, they discovered a gorgeous woman with red hair. She was lovingly cradling an infant with curly locks. The child's cheeks were rosy, and her skin was the same pale tone as her mother's. She was the picture of health as she lay dozing sweetly in the consort's arms. "I have brought the one you wished to see, milady." Jinshi no longer spoke in the jocular manner of earlier. He comported himself with perfect gravity. "Thank you for your trouble." Jayokaiu smiled, a smile that was warmer than Jinshi's, and bowed her head to Maomao. Maomao looked at her in surprise. "I possess no station to warrant such acknowledgement, milady." She chose her words carefully, trying not to offend. She hadn't been born to a life where such care was necessary, so she wasn't sure she was doing it right. "Oh, but you do. And I will do much more to show my gratitude to you, my daughter's savior. I am certain there has been some misunderstanding." "Perhaps you have the wrong person," Maomao said. She felt herself break into a cold sweat. She was being polite, but she was still contradicting an imperial consort. She hoped her head would stay on her shoulders. She did not want to be involved with people like these, or be forced into service for any noble or royal. Jinshi noticed the concern on Jayokai's face. He showed the cloth to Maomao with a flourish. "Are you aware that this is the material used in the maids' work clothes? Now that you mention it, sir, I see the resemblance." She would play stupid to the very end. Even though she knew it was useless, she continued, "It's more than a resemblance." This came from the uniform of a girl connected to the Shang of sartorial affairs. The palace serving staff were grouped into 6 Shang, which were the main offices of employment. The Shang Fu, also known as the wardrobe service, dealt with the distribution of clothing. Maomao belonged to this group, and she was largely charged with doing laundry. The unbleached skirt she wore matched the color of the fabric in Jinshi's hands. If anyone inspected her skirt, they would find an unusual seam. This seam was hidden carefully on the inside. In other words, the proof was right there before them. Maomao doubted Jinchi would do anything so uncouth as to check for himself right in front of consort Gyokyo. She couldn't be sure, though. She decided she had best own up before she was publicly humiliated. "What exactly is it that you both want from me?" she asked. The two of them looked at each other. Apparently they took this as confirmation. Both had the sweetest of smiles on their faces. The only sound in the room was the whispering breath of the sleeping child. Maomao sighed, almost as softly. The very next day, Maomao was obliged to pack up her meagre belongings. Xirolan and all the other women who shared a room with her were properly jealous. They pestered her endlessly about how this turn of events had come about. Maomao could only give her most strained smile and try to pretend it was not a great matter. She was to be a lady-in-waiting to the emperor's favoured consort. She had, in a word, made it. Chapter 6 is titled Poison Tester. Jinchi found this a most congenial turn of events. The unusual girl he had discovered by sheer chance would now help him solve one of his many problems. Lady Gyokyo, the emperor's favoured consort, was presently served by 4 ladies-in-waiting. That number might be enough for some concubine of mean account. However, for a high-ranking consort like Gyokyo, it seemed rather too few. The ladies-in-waiting insisted that the 4 of them were perfectly sufficient to take care of everything that needed doing. Gyokyo herself did not seem inclined to press for more servants. Jinchi understood well why this was the case. Consort Gyokyo was a cheerful and generally tranquil person, but she was also intelligent and careful. In the garden of women that was the rear palace, a woman who received imperial favour and was not suspicious of others was in mortal danger. There had been several prior attempts on Gyokyo's life. One notable instance occurred when she became pregnant with the child who would become Princess Lingli. Because of this, she initially had 10 ladies in waiting, but now had less than half that number. Usually, a lady brought her own servants when she first arrived at the rear palace. However, Gyokyo had used special privilege to bring in that nursemaid. She would not accept an anonymous servant girl from a distant part of the rear palace as one of her ladies in waiting. But she had her position as a high consort to consider. Surely she could accept at least one more woman. This is where the freckled girl entered the picture. She had saved Gyokyo's daughter, so the consort would likely welcome her. The girl also knew something about poisons. This could be very useful. There was a chance this freckled girl would use her knowledge for evil, but if she tried anything, they could simply corner her somewhere she couldn't do much harm. It was all so simple. Jinchi thought with a grin that he could always use his charms if all else failed. He found it just as repugnant as everyone else that he was so ready to take advantage of his ethereal beauty. But he had no intention of changing his ways. Indeed, his looks were what gave Jinchi his value in life. When one became a servant assigned to a specific mistress and a lady in waiting to the emperor's favourite consort, one found that one's treatment improved. Maomao had been at the very bottom of the palace hierarchy until recently. Now she found herself among the middle ranks. She was told her salary would increase significantly. However, 20% of her earnings would go to her family. This meant the merchants who had sold her into this life would receive the money. She considered it a distasteful arrangement. It was a system created so greedy officials could line their pockets. She was also given her own room. It was cramped, but a far cry from the overcrowded accommodations she had shared in the past. She had gone from a meagre reed mat and a single sheet for bedding to an actual bed. Granted, it took up half her room, but Maomao was frankly happy to be able to get up in the morning without treading all over her co-workers. She had one more cause for celebration, although she wouldn't know it until later. The Jade Pavilion where Gyokyo lived was home to 4 other ladies in waiting besides Maomao. A nursemaid had recently been dismissed. People said this was because the princess was starting to be weaned. However, Maomao suspected there was another reason. The number of women attending Consort Lihua seemed quite small. Consort Lihua had more than 10 ladies in waiting attending her. the ladies of Gyokaiu were quite surprised to learn that someone considered relatively unimportant in the palace had suddenly become their colleague. However, they did not harass Maomao as much as she had anticipated. They seemed sympathetic toward her, if anything, but why, she thought, she would find out soon enough. A palace meal, packed with ingredients traditionally believed to be of medicinal benefit, sat before her. One by one, Hongniang, the head of Gyokaiu's ladies-in-waiting, took samples. She put them on little saucers, placing them in front of Maomao. Gyokaiu observed the scene apologetically, but she gave no indication that she was going to stop what was happening. The other 3 ladies-in-waiting likewise watched with pitying gazes. The location was Gyokaiu's room. It was appointed in the highest style, and it was where the consort ate all her meals.